We're exploring spiritual conversations again this week. Last week, we took a cue from the disciples when Thomas blurted out, "I won't believe." There's no record of them flying off the handle, putting Thomas down, or making Thomas feel belittled or foolish. They just listened and waited.
This week, we hear the story of how after Jesus' resurrection, Peter said to the other disciples, "I'm going fishing." And he meant it, literal fishing with nets. What he and some of the other disciples had left to follow Jesus, struggling to believe that he really was risen, they went backward to something they were familiar with, fishing for fish.
So, the risen Jesus related to them where they were, fishing. He didn't say, "You dummies, I'm risen from the dead. You're supposed to be out sharing that." He went to where they were, fishing, and even helped them catch a huge amount of fish. He related. And then he used the catch of fish to point the disciples to their new calling, to be fishers of people.
They would get there because Jesus took the time to relate to them rather than berate them for going fishing. He chatted with them, sat on the beach and ate with them. And eventually, they caught on.
There. I know how Dave feels too. Peter was never one to sit still for very long. And so he gets up and says, "I'm going fishing." And takes a few of his friends along with him. I know how Peter feels. And whether you know it or not, you know how Peter feels too. Let me explain. After an extraordinary moment in our lives, and we are entering into the season of extraordinary moments. Some of you will be celebrating graduations in the coming weeks. We're entering into wedding season. Some of you may be going to weddings in the coming weeks. I imagine most of you are planning for summer vacations. We are entering into the season of extraordinary moments. And after the extraordinary moment happens, even if the extraordinary moment is a man rising from the dead, I think there always comes a moment when we want to go back to our routines. And there's comfort in that. It just feels good to sleep in our own bed again. And there's comfort in the way that morning cup of coffee that you get at home tastes just the way you like it. After the extraordinary thing happens, we want to go back to our routines because there's comfort in that. And we want to go back to whatever it is we know best. Whatever it is we do that we really know how to do well. For Peter, that was fishing. That was his routine. That's what he knew best, and he had comfort in that. After the extraordinary thing happens, what is your routine? What is it for you? What is it that you know best, that thing you really know how to do well, and the comfort that you find in it? I know how Peter feels, and you do too. But this time, when Peter goes fishing, he's going back to where it all started, because history is actually repeating itself in this text. Because going back to get in that boat out on the Sea of Tiberias, he is going back to the very place where he met Jesus for the first time. And history is repeating itself because the exact same thing happened then that happens now. There's no fish in the net. And so a man comes walking along the shore and says, "Do you have any fish?" "No, throw your net on the other side." It is history repeating itself. And it's only at that moment that they realize what is really going on, that Jesus is here too, and he is the one making history repeat itself. Throw your net on the other side, and the net is full of fish. But there's a problem with that too, because this time, when Jesus appears on this shore, after he has risen from the dead, those nets are empty. And the problem is oftentimes after the most extraordinary thing happens in our lives, like a man rising from the dead, when we return to those routines, when we return to what it is that we know best, those things are as empty and as hollow as those nets. Maybe you know that feeling too. After the extraordinary happens, we go back to the ordinary things of our lives, and they are as empty and as hollow as those nets. What do we do then? Well, the beautiful thing is that Jesus is here too, at that moment, and doing the same thing he always does, inviting us in. I love this story. Of all the stories in the four Gospels, I think this one really is my favorite because there's a marvelous simplicity to the story. There's this profound humanity to what is going on here. Everything about this is ordinary. There is no dawn from on high. There is no mountaintop. It's just Jesus sitting on the side of the beach with a campfire, grilling fish and breaking bread. And as the dawn comes, the disciples would think nothing of this man, except for the fact that maybe they smell the grilled fish and the fresh baked bread, and they realize just how hungry they are, having fished all night. And they can't even see the man's face, except that when they hear his voice, "Have you any fish? Throw your net on the other side." And then they know, because history is repeating itself, they know that this is their risen Lord from the dead. And everything about him that was so irresistible for the 3 years that they walked with him has come back again. And Peter can't help himself but to jump out of the boat, swim to shore. And I love the scene of it. I like to imagine that these disciples get to that campfire and they're sopping wet. And they sit down and they look upon the face of their risen Lord again. And Jesus just so simply, so humanly says, "Have some fish to eat. Come and have breakfast. Here's some bread. Bring some of those fish over. You're hungry. Have a bite to eat." And I like to imagine that there weren't a whole lot of words said, but it was a spiritual conversation. And John doesn't even record it for us because I have a sense that the disciples, after they are looking into the face of their risen Lord, they don't want to write the words down because this is something that they're just keeping for themselves. The spiritual conversation. It's so marvelously simple, so profoundly human. But there's actually one detail that we would miss if we're not looking close enough, and it's actually lost in translation. It's one little verb that John uses. The verb is the verb he uses for how the disciples are pulling the nets in. First, when the nets are empty, then when the net is full, and then when Jesus tells them to bring the net in so he can grill some of those fish. It's the same verb. It's the verb that I think most accurately we would translate as to draw. They are drawing the nets to themselves. And this isn't the first time that the Gospel of John has used this verb. Way back at the beginning, very early on in the Gospel, Jesus says, I will be lifted up and I will draw all people to myself. The exact same verb, as if he is drawing a net full of fish. I am drawing all people to myself. And as Ms. Lively reminded us, we got a vision of how that will happen at the end of all time. But he is drawing all people to himself. And that's a promise he intends to keep each and every day. Which leads me to wonder, what draws you to Jesus? Maybe it's one of the parables, like the prodigal son or the good Samaritan. What draws you to Jesus? Maybe it's one of the miracles, like walking on water or feeding the 5,000. What draws you to Jesus? Maybe it's one of those encounters Jesus had with the down and out rather than the up and coming, like the Samaritan woman at the well, or wee little Zacchaeus, or Nicodemus who comes to him in the dead of night. What draws you to Jesus? Maybe it's something he said, like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," or "Consider the lilies of the field and how they grow." What draws you to Jesus? I ask the question because it may just be that in a little while from now, as you walk away from here, you may be gathered at a table with people you love, and you may be sharing a simple meal. And that would be an opportunity to share with each other what draws you to Jesus, and that would be a spiritual conversation. But it also makes me wonder about the people who are not in this room. What draws them to Jesus? I will be lifted up and I will draw all people to myself. That's a promise he intends to keep. What draws others to Jesus? We ultimately cannot know. We can't get inside somebody else's skin. We can't get inside their head. But just the fact that us asking ourselves that question, what draws others to Jesus, opens us up to be able to listen to another person's story. What draws them to Jesus? Because ultimately, we're not the ones who draw anybody to Jesus. Jesus is drawing them to himself. He takes that burden off of us so that we can be free to simply live and to love the others around us. But sometimes, we get to come along for the ride. Sometimes we get to walk alongside someone who is being drawn to Jesus. And when that happens, we have an opportunity to be open and to listen, to hear their story, and maybe to share ours. And that's when the spiritual conversation can begin, by being open and listening and sharing as they are being drawn to Jesus. If we are willing to walk alongside them long enough, I can guarantee you there is a miracle that will happen. This is a promise Jesus intends to keep. And the miracle of it is this: if we are willing to walk alongside these others as they are being drawn to Jesus, if we are willing to be open and to listen to their story, the miracle that will happen is there will come a point where you will look in their face and you will see in their face the very face of Jesus. You will see the exact same thing the disciples saw sitting cross-legged on that beach when they looked up dripping with water and they saw the face of their risen Lord. You will see the exact same thing, the face of Jesus in the face of this other person as you are walking alongside, being drawn to Jesus. And when that happens, you will see something about Jesus you have never seen before. And you will be drawn to him in a whole new way. Because often, the spiritual conversations of our lives do not need a whole lot of words. And sometimes the most spiritual thing we can do is to make breakfast for the people we love. Because ultimately, the most spiritual thing that can happen to any one of us is when Jesus makes breakfast for us. In the name of our risen Lord, amen.